Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 5th of December 2014, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. Behind the tech desk is Nick Green, and we've got our special guest today, Mark Anderson. Where do we start? Weather, I suppose. Bright blue sky, sunny, very cold, lots of dog walkers out, and up in Aberdeen, if I've got this right, Scotland anyway, it's also blue sky and sunshine. I'm going to be shocked because I was supposed to do a special weather report on north of the border. But anyway, one report we've had from the far north, as far as we're concerned here in Plymouth, is that it's pretty good. So there we are. Don't know how many shopping days till Christmas. I think we'll start working on that next week.
Do we care?
Not really.
No. I think we're starting with ATFOD, our friends at ATFOD. So this is what the Independent here is calling the sexist new pornography restrictions. But they're saying that these aren't just an act of censorship, but could be the first step towards something even worse. They're pointing out, I'm just going to read a little bit of this. It says, as you might have already heard, an act of state censorship has been declared against British pornography in the guise of innocuous regulation. But what you might not know is that it has also marked the first stage in a campaign to impose global trade sanctions. Strangely, the proposition has received less coverage, this proposition has received less coverage. And then he talks about Peter Johnson, the director of the Authority for Television on Demand, who has explicitly stated that he believes pornographic websites with editorial control outside the UK may be in breach of the Obscene Publications Act 1959 if their content is downloaded in this country. And therefore he's arguing that in fact ATFOD would have the authority to regulate video on demand outside the jurisdiction of the United Kingdom. He says there are very difficult jurisdictional issues about whether material hosted overseas is within reach of the English criminal law. However, if a website is hosted abroad and is downloaded in the UK, there is publication both when images are uploaded and when they are downloaded. And so this, as everybody that has been following the UK Column News for quite some time will know, this is absolutely what we've been warning about. Actually, the pornographic industry has been warning about this for a lot longer. They have met with Peter Johnson personally and certainly when they spoke to us, they gave us pretty stark warnings about what his actual agenda is. And his determination to regulate the whole of the internet. Now, just as a reminder, what they did with us, remember, was that they attempted to say that we were running a video on demand service when in fact what we were doing was putting videos on YouTube. So we were producing videos, putting them on YouTube, which is a video on demand service. YouTube is a service, but they were saying that we were running a service. We weren't running a service. We were using a service. So, in fact, what they were attempting to do, therefore, was to regulate people who were using YouTube, and, in fact, they were attempting to regulate people who were using YouTube, even down to the point of what, individuals, potentially individuals operating out of their own bedrooms. So, very, very dangerous is what we said at the time. And if you want to see the coverage that we made of this at the time, please have a look at this article from June. Called ATFOD, a major risk to freedom of speech on the internet. If you read down through that, that is the original press release that we released in June describing what had happened in our case. And then at the bottom of that page are the 3 videos that we made when we were doing not the UK Column News, because at that time, if you remember, we were not allowed to be terribly television-like. And so we made 3 videos really highlighting the dangers and the risks involved in allowing ATFOD to operate unchallenged. And so we bring this straight back to your attention again because we've made another major step along the road of regulation of the internet as a whole. And we see this as a major danger, setting aside any issues that we may have with pornography at this stage.
That's absolutely right. And I'll just add to that, if I may, that if you actually go back and have a look at what the pornography industry was saying, we're talking 2 or 3 years ago now, they were absolutely warning what was going to follow the initial attack on them. So we're detaching ourselves from the issue of pornography here. What we're doing is focusing on ATVOD, and remember that the ATVOD board making up the rules as they go along. They claim they're independent, but of course, if you look at the interests of ATVOD's board members, their interests are so broad, so deep, there is no possible way they're independent of anybody who is in the mainstream media.
Well, in fact, that's a very good point. And I'd just like to remind people what Ruth Evans, who's the chairman of ATVOD, said to the House of Lords Select Committee on Communications Inquiry on Media Convergence and Public Policy Impact, and that was in 2013. And she said that ATVOD had trouble defining television-like services. She said, yes, it is an evolving art, So it's not written in stone. It's not written in statute and defined correctly. They are literally making their policy up as they go along. The pornographic industry warning that Peter Johnson himself has a personal agenda, and that involves the regulation of the wider internet. And we're seeing that take another step forward today.
I'll just add as an end comment, and of course it is very interesting that effectively ATVOD is making its money out of regulating the porn industry anyway.
Yes.
So totally devious, two-faced organisation. But isn't it interesting that we've now got mainstream media picking up on the dangers of this, I think the word is pernicious little organisation.
Before we move on, Mark, have you any comments on this?
Well, nothing in depth at this point, but certainly you guys are doing the right thing in sorting this out. You know, whatever one may think of pornography, you didn't provide a service, you used a service, and you need to keep defining this in the way that you're doing, so ATVOD doesn't take too many more steps to squelch freedom of speech in the UK.
Are you saying the same kind of thing happening in the United States?
Well, maybe more surreptitious way, not in such a semi-blatant way. The First Amendment, rather, to the United States Constitution for free speech is pretty strong. Of course, the battle is always not so much what you're free to say, it's what you're free to do.
Yes.
So much can be done in terms of freedom of speech, but then when you try and actually enact changes, when you go beyond talking and you want to actually change policy and have the U.S. citizens and the people have real influence, that's where you run into a wall here. Congress being so detached and so out of touch with the people. So not in a precise way, but the people being heard is always a challenge.
Well, speaking of Congress, and particularly the U.S. House of Representatives, Global Research here pointing out yesterday's resolution in the House, House Resolution 758, and that's entitled Strongly Condemning the Actions of the Russian Federation under President Vladimir Putin, which has carried out a policy of aggression against neighbouring countries aimed at political and economic domination. And Mark, I mean, the sheer hypocrisy of that title on its own is pretty stark, is it not? Because they're accusing Putin of aggression against neighbouring countries aimed at political and economic domination, when the US and Britain and the European Union are absolutely have a policy of aggression, not against neighbouring countries, but just about any country that they feel like having a policy against, for exactly political and economic domination. Is that not a fair assessment of what they're about?
The hypocrisy is about the thickest I've ever seen, guys. Everything they're accusing Russia of doing is what the EU and NATO and the US and Britain are guilty of. It's an exact reversal. Well, you don't even know where to go with it. The hypocrisy is so thick. Petro Poroshenko in Kiev, they portray as the face of democracy. He is the furthest thing from the face of democracy that you can imagine. He's carrying out outright aggression and genocide in East Ukraine, blaming it on Putin and Russia. Yes, there are Russian separatists and, loose cannons that are sympathetic to Russia, but it's not the Russian general forces that are attacking Ukraine. It's Kiev's own forces that are attacking Russian-leaning parts of Ukraine. And of course, as I've reported on here and elsewhere, Poroshenko had spoke to Congress in the middle of September, begging for money and materiel. And now we hear from Global Research and other sources that money is already going to Poroshenko via NATO and other channels ahead of any U.S. legislation to underwrite Poroshenko's aggression. But the Congress is also looking at bills to fund Poroshenko as he requested when he spoke to Congress.
Yeah.
And now we have Donald Tusk, the former Polish prime minister, coming in as the head of the European Council. He's talking to Obama on the phone just a few days ago. The ink wasn't even dry on his new job for the contract for that when they spoke not only in favor of Ukraine versus Russia, but also in favor of the transatlantic trade deal, that huge ripoff being conducted in secret. So
we'll come on. We'll come on to that in a second in a bit more detail, Mark. But the other thing that happened yesterday was that the amendments that were made to the Defence Authorization Bill, which would have restricted access to, well, restricted some funding for Obama's war against the Islamic State. Those amendments were voted down. So this basically gives Obama free rein to basically do as he likes with regard to Islamic State. Where do you see him taking the United States?
Just read that headline there. I think is America.
No, well, that's what we've already covered. Yeah. That. Where do you see the Obama wanting to take the United States? Are we going to see boots on the ground again?
Well, of course, to a degree, there already are boots on the ground. Today's advisor is tomorrow's soldier with a gun. But the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act that you're talking about, is, of course, done every year. It's a very lengthy bill that funds and underwrites and determines the general framework and mission of the U.S. military, which, of course, is a huge establishment, the largest on earth, the largest in history in terms of militaries. Yes, if the amendments were foregone and they're not going to apply any amendments, then you're absolutely right. It would free Obama's hand not only toward ISIS, but probably toward Ukraine and underwriting Poroshenko as well.
Right.
I haven't read the 2015 NDAA yet. I've been in Congress when they worked on the 2013 and 2014. Some things stay the same, some things change. It's like reading Tolstoy's War and Peace every time they come around to it. But the absence of amendments is very troubling indeed. And they're already hell-bent on underwriting ISIS, even though ISIS, so-called ISIS, is largely elements of the Syrian Free Army that the U.S. has already been funding. And that's to overthrow Assad directly or indirectly, the leader of Syria. And Global Research and other sources have said that the Toyota trucks that ISIS is driving into Iraq with were the very same vehicles that the U.S. helped provide to the Syrian Free Army. So the Syrian Free Army and ISIS are interchangeable, and we've already been funding the Free Army. So formally funding, through the NDAA is just more of what they've already been doing. Just different ways of achieving the same goal of stirring the pot and trying to overthrow Assad in Syria.
Well, indeed. Now, of course, Putin is pretty wise to what's going on and was yesterday giving his opinion of it in an address to the Federal Assembly, which is their government, their parliament, I suppose. And he said, among other things, of course, we have the right to ask questions. What was the Ukrainian tragedy for? Wasn't it possible to settle all the issues, even disputed issues, within a legal framework and legitimately? But now we're being told that this was actually competent, balanced policies that we should comply with unquestioningly and blindfolded. And he went on to say, if for some European countries national pride is a long-forgotten concept and sovereignty is too much of a luxury, true sovereignty for Russia is absolutely necessary for survival. Primarily, we should realize that this is a nation. We should like to emphasize this. Either we remain a sovereign nation or we dissolve without a trace and lose our identity. Of course, other countries need to understand this too. All participants in international life should be aware of this. And he's really giving this sort of a nationalist, sovereign, we are determined to maintain our sovereignty under all circumstances speech here. and it's really a bit of a rallying cry for the Russian people to get behind him. And really, who can blame him? He's being pushed into this. I think he's being pushed into this situation quite strongly. Yeah, I have to say, you've got to see some similarities between what has happened in Ukraine with what they attempted to push through in 2008 in Georgia and South Ossetia. And it's the same type of operation going on, and with NATO absolutely determined to push expansion towards Russian borders. You can kind of understand why he's starting to make these types of speeches, but undoubtedly this speech will be presented in the Western media as being some kind of Hitler-esque rallying cry. So, I mean...
Well, if you support your country, you're extreme right-wing,
yes.
Isn't it? That's the way it's normally done, principally by the BBC. We'll come on to them in a minute.
Any thoughts on that, Mark?
Well, it's interesting to build on what you're talking about, Mike, that they accuse Russia of being aggressive with its military, flying fighter jets close to borders. But what they're doing is they're flying their fighter jets, the Russian jets, along the Russian border, protecting their country and showing a little bit of force, a little bit of defensiveness, because it's the NATO and European Union forces and interests that are pushing eastward toward Russia. And all Russia's doing is showing its sovereignty, staying within its own borders. And so a Russian jet will fly in Russian airspace near another border, and they'll accuse Russia of aggression, but they're only showing that they're capable of defending their country. And as you say, Putin's declaring his sovereignty. But the international system that John Kerry, the U.S. Secretary of State, worships, they ask U.S. troops, men and women in uniform, to go out and no longer protect the Constitution, but go protect the international system, which, of course, is the banking and corporate system. Yeah. Who wants to fight and die on a battlefield for that? Any hands raised in the air? I don't see any. And so, yeah, you have this golden calf mentality here of protecting the banksters and the financial interests and blaming Russia for aggression when Putin, while he may not be an angel, is certainly not guilty of any aggression, but only showing enough force to prove that he's not a pushover.
Yeah. Yes. Well, this next one then was an article that you asked us to put in here, which is from Global Research, entitled "All-Out War in Ukraine: NATO's Final Offensive." What was it in here that you wanted to highlight in particular?
Well, I don't have it in front of me like you guys do. I see it kind of in a smaller framework, but after scanning that article, what I got out of it mainly was that NATO is behind funding and supporting Ukraine, as I intimated earlier, ahead of the curve of anything the U.S. Congress might do to underwrite Poroshenko.
Yes.
So while on the one hand, people are saying, when is the U.S. Congress going to honor Poroshenko's speech back in September and underwrite Poroshenko's aggression against East Ukraine? We're wondering, there is a bill in Congress, we're wondering when that's going to happen. But this article that you bring up here shows that NATO is already pouring resources into Ukraine and Kiev, a government that was started by a coup d'etat in February of this year when they overthrew Yanukovych. And so that's the main thing, is NATO's ahead of the curve, ahead of the U.S. Congress in helping Poroshenko.
Well, actually, it's interesting that they are totally disingenuous on this one, because, as you point out, they are acting one way and talking another way. So at the NATO foreign ministers meeting in Brussels on the 2nd, which was Tuesday, I think, they said that ministers agreed, their sort of press release said that ministers agreed at this time of tension there is a need for regular communications among NATO and Russian military to avoid any incidents, and that NATO military authorities should keep channels of military communications open and use them when necessary to avoid any possible misunderstandings related to military activities. I mean, that is a staggering little bit of rhetoric, isn't it? Because they're doing one thing in one hand, and they're saying to Russia, well, really, you shouldn't worry about it too much, because we'll keep the communications open, and we'll tell you what we're prepared to tell you that we're doing, but we're going to do this anyway. It's
yeah. Don't mind the anti-missile defense system right on your border. Don't mind these artillery over here. We'll stay in communication, right?
Yes.
Mark, can I just ask, do you, or is there any information or comment coming out from sort of in the body of the US military? Do you hear what serving military people are saying about this situation in the States?
No, not directly. I know some soldiers and ex-soldiers, current and former, that I could call, but no, I don't have a handle on that yet. On those rare occasions when I get a chance to talk to soldiers, like when I go to Washington, D.C., either they don't comment and they, kind of stay tight-lipped, or there does tend to be just kind of a general unease about the fact that these wars never end, that there's no definable or achievable victory. And this feeling that they're fighting, as I say, for this vague, nebulous international system and not constitutional framework, not constitutional principles anymore. Of course, even constitutional wars can be misguided. Let's not be naive. But yeah, not anything at this time, especially. But in the recent past, I've spoken to some men and women in uniform, but not lately.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, okay, right, we'll move on then. As you mentioned earlier, Donald Tusk, and actually we discussed Donald Tusk on Monday, and he actually became President of the European Council on Monday. That effectively makes him President of Europe, but as we pointed out, there are actually two presidents of Europe. He's one of them. But you highlighted this article here that the new President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, tells his personal story. I was just wondering what in particular in this article grabbed your attention?
Well, I mainly wrote about, for American Free Press, the fact that Tusk was appointed, replacing Herman Van Rompuy, if I'm saying his name right, as European Council President. I wrote about the fact that Tusk, the former Polish Prime Minister, now head of the European Council, got on the phone his very first day, December 1st, with President Obama, and they got right into the transatlantic trade and investment partnership, which I've been following very closely, because the ISIS crisis and Ebola and all this stuff has been so blown out of proportion, or just kept to be, the only subject practically at hand, that these very damaging and long-range trade deals, like the transatlantic as well as the trans-Pacific deals, are pushed to the back burner. UK and US news consumers are not hearing about them much, if at all.
Do you want to just give us
That's what I've been reporting on.
Sorry, Mark. Do you want to just give us a quick overview of TTIP?
Yeah, it's the first ever formal. Excuse me, it's kind of early here. First ever formal US-EU trade deal that would comprise about 45% of GDP. And the European Union delegation to the U.S. is a lobbying arm. They have a Washington office on K Street, a famous lobbying street in Washington, D.C. And through that delegation in D.C., through that lobbying arm, they've visited all 50 states in the U.S. to get state governors and local city governments on board. And they're trying to bring this first ever major trade deal together that would have this huge chunk of the GDP, as I mentioned. And they're putting such a high priority on it. I mean, the very first day Tusk is in office, they're talking about stepping this up. And Tusk was quoted as saying, "I was happy to hear the American president has an equally strong commitment to our transatlantic bond." Transatlantic bondage would be more accurate.
Yeah.
And then Tusk added, "We discussed the important work ahead in negotiating the transatlantic trade and investment partnership." But he added, TTIP is not just about free trade, it's an expression of our geopolitical partnership. We agreed to step up our efforts, quote unquote. And geopolitical partnership and going beyond just free trade is code speak for the fact that they're trying to create a new common market between the U.S. and the EU, which they've admitted. Just like when they started the European Union some 50, 60 years ago.
That's exactly what I was going to say. It's exactly the same type of thing. We create a common market to begin with, and then we move towards a federalist superstate type of political arm of that. So it begins with trade and ends up with politics. And at the end of the day, the destruction of the nation state and any kind of self autonomy or independence or sovereignty.
Oh, absolutely. Here we've had think tanks for decades, like the Atlantic Council, use terms like Atlanticism. They coin words like that, and they don't even see the Atlantic Ocean as a barrier to their designs. So it's quite troubling, especially in the fact that it's done so surreptitiously. On the one hand, they talk openly about it, but the infrastructure is being built in virtual total secrecy.
Yes. Spectacular.
Yeah, well, perhaps that gives us a nice introduction to say, where are you not going to find the truth? And the answer, of course, is the BBC, which has been used as a massive British government propaganda machine to simply not tell the public about what's really been happening. I mean, the areas that we just covered are never covered in detail on the BBC, and certainly the true background story in Ukraine. But we found this interesting, that the Daily Telegraph has printed quite a massive article on the BBC with a very big graphic with all sorts of statistic about the size of the BBC's budget and £3.72 billion. Now remember, of course, that's only public broadcasting, and on top of that there's about 1.2 billion, 1.25 billion in what is now a BBC private corporation, which is taking on the world's media stream. But nevertheless, the Telegraph delving in, and it says, under siege, the biased BBC fights for its life. They pointing out that 91 BBC directors earn vastly more than the Prime Minister. But it gets more interesting if we get into the depth of what's reported. So the Sun has been taking the main pot shot at the BBC. Interesting, the Telegraph follows what the Sun does. So there's nothing new about the Sun taking aim at the BBC. This week it was run three full pages of reports criticising the BBC executive salaries, cronyism, financial waste and left-wing bias, backed up by two forthright leader columns. These issues have been frequently and rightly probed by newspapers, including this one, for years. Well, that's how it starts off. But what it goes on to say eventually in this pretty long article is that what every politician eventually comes to realise is that there are no votes in bashing the BBC. Broadly speaking, the British love it, and £2.80 per week per household is good value. The BBC will go on after 2016, and some kind of universal funding, even if it's not called a TV licence, will continue too. So you're lured into an article that you think is actually finally going to take the BBC to task, to expose it for what it is, which is a thoroughly biased, corrupt organisation swallowing 3.7 billion of public money. And what do? Well, they lead you into actually, everybody loves the BBC. It's good value for money, and you're not going to get rid of it. So really disingenuous reporting by the Daily Telegraph. And I'm just going to remind people that it was the UK column exposure as to what was going on with the likes of BBC monitoring, funded by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the BBC running soap operas to change society in Kazakhstan, and BBC Media Action, a so-called charity working to help destabilise countries like Syria, Afghanistan, etc. It's all there in front of our eyes. So one of the problems we've got, Mark, is this massive, gigantic BBC machine. We fund it, the ordinary people in Britain are funding it, and what it's being used for propaganda. I'll just give you a right to reply on that if you've got anything to say about how you see the BBC versus American media streams, and then I've got a bit more to add.
Well, briefly, a lot of people here, the average news consumer, actually sees the BBC as a legitimate and in-depth news organization. I know a lot of people that aren't quite as clued in on the nefarious parts of politics as we are, that say, oh, wow, the BBC, at least they get a fresh perspective. At least it's not ABC, NBC. They see it as a more kind of, straight ahead, straight news, pull no punches kind of organization. But they don't hear what you're speaking of now, the private arm of the BBC acting as a virtual intelligence agency, undermining countries. almost like a military propaganda arm. That's the part that the average American consumer doesn't see. So it's very good that we're bringing that out, and that needs to be spread more widely, because I think the U.S. consumer mostly has a rather romantic view of the BBC, almost, that they're a step above our news networks here.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I'm going to say that I share that view, that it's. I think it's tragic that so many people overseas are still totally lured into a false sense of security. They hear the BBC, they think, here it is, the good, reliable, trustworthy BBC, but it's nothing of the kind. Now, if we follow on from the story where I started with the Telegraph, let's have a look at this, because the man that they refer to in the article is John Shield, the Director of Communications for the BBC. He's on a mere £144,000 a year. But this is the meat of it. The Telegraph said the surprise this week has not been the Sun newspaper's criticisms of the BBC or even George Osborne, but the BBC's response. And what they say is that this is the first time that they can remember the BBC coming out fighting when it's been challenged by a non-libelous newspaper piece. I'm not sure why that's thrown in. And they then go on to say, well, the BBC man who has rebuffed all of this criticism is called John Shield. He's a likeable and thoughtful chap with a strategic mind, a flinty resolve born of years in government communications. Both he and Reid were recruited from the Department for Work and Pensions, and before that, Shield trained at number 10 Downing Street at the knee of Alastair Campbell. Well, here we're getting into the meat of it, because the paper is now showing that this man is an absolute spin doctor. And we're going to say, well, who is he? Well, let's have a look. Here he is. Looks pretty trustworthy to me. I wouldn't leave him with my pet hamster. But if we get into his biography, he is a government propaganda man. He was Director of Communications at the Department of Work and Pensions. He's headed up, he's been head of communication for news, current affairs and sport at the BBC, but he was also Director of Communications at the Department for Communications for Local Government. Here's the propaganda machine getting into the local government level. Head of News at the Department for Education and Skills, and he also worked at the Foreign Office and number 10. This man isn't independent in any shape or form. He's absolutely 100% a government trusted pair of hands designed to protect the BBC. So we're going to say UK column is going to stay hot on the case of the BBC. It's quite interesting. Even Russia Today is now getting interested in how the BBC has been burying itself in former Eastern Bloc states. And of course, what they're trying to do is take control of the media there. So how does the propaganda work? Well, we thought we'd just give you a little local example. So here's BBC News Cornwall, and here's the headline: more firearm officers to be recruited in Devon and Cornwall. So we're going to say this is a pure example of propaganda and political nudging. So the headline, if we just keep it simple, is that there's an increase in recruiting for firearms officers, but overall there's a 15% increase in armed police in Devon and Cornwall. So let's have a look at the man who's been writing it. So we've got Simon Hall, the BBC South West Home Affairs correspondent, and this is what he said: it's a proud tradition of British policing to be largely unarmed, even in these days of an enhanced terrorist threat. This may be a significant increase in the number of officers in Devon and Cornwall who carry guns, but nevertheless, the proportion of armed police in the force still remains a small fraction of its total strength. And that sees Devon and Cornwall remaining true to the unarmed principle of British policing, as well as reflecting the fact that this is a low crime area. So we just highlight that because basically he's saying the tradition of Britain's police is to be unarmed. We're now giving a substantial increase in arming. But this is staying true to the fact that Britain's police are unarmed. This is nonsense. And it's not until you analyse it line by line, you can see that this BBC reporter is pushing absolute propaganda. He's supporting there's a terrorist threat. We're still waiting for the British government to define the terrorist threat. He's saying it's a low crime area, so we don't need police, let alone guns. And then we've got a massive increase, and he's saying, well, this is in line with police not carrying guns. I'll give you 30 seconds on that one if you'd like just to come in, Mark. Is it just us? I know your boys are armed up to the hilts, but we understand there's now 63,000 automatic weapons stashed in Britain for our police forces to use, and we don't have guns.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, here, of course, the average citizen is armed. There's more private firearms in the United States than any single army in the world. And beyond that, of course, our police are a lot of ex-military people who are trained to view anyone outside themselves as the enemy, so a lot of them abuse their power. We have federal funding to fund our police and turn them into military units, virtual military units, armored personnel carriers, fully automatic weapons and whatnot. And we have our elite and our elite media here in a function like the BBC, stirring up racial hatred and playing black against white to create kind of a powder keg mentality to then justify the police cracking down in a police state fashion. That's the dynamic happening here. I do wish, though, that we had less arms in the hands of our police, because police are not inherently more trustworthy with a gun than the average citizen. That's a myth. And so I believe the British tradition of largely unarmed police should be carried out, should be forwarded. But this reporter is speaking out both sides of his mouth here.
Yeah.
Especially with an undefined terrorist threat, as you mentioned.
Yeah, well, look, let's just add a little bit more to that. So, Nick, if you can bring that one back on screen for us, thank you. I'll just add in this. This is the comment by Chief Superintendent Jim Nye, who's the head of operations, Devon and Cornwall Police. He says a strategic threat assessment for firearms cover in Devon and Cornwall has been carried out using intelligence and the history of firearms incidents. The force had cover to deal with expected threats, but senior officers had decided they wanted to ensure there was sufficient cover in more remote parts of the two counties. And then wait for this, it's important to emphasise this is not in response to any new threat. But the article we've just gone through is trying to tell us there is a new threat. So this is a classic BBC article. There's no proper analysis of what's going on. And we've got people, as you say, speaking out both sides of their mouth. Well, here it is, University of Exeter page, and it's giving us a bit more detail on Simon Hall. And I'm just going to say, if you look into his history, he began in broadcasting as a DJ. So there we are, that's the meat of it, but he's been trained up with the BBC, now part of the government propaganda. And if we really want, of course, to remind people what this is about, this was UK column front page. Marcus Agius, former chairman of Barclays Bank, he left under a little bit of a cloud. The Telegraph doesn't want to get into this man, and what is he really up to? Just bring it up on the screen. So he's Barclays Bank, or was. He's a Bilderberger, being paid £47,000 for 28 days work a year with the BBC. I mean, you don't have to make it up, do you? Right, well, before I hand back over to Mike, just very, very quickly, the UK column's been warning about behaviour change being pushed in by the British government, the so-called nudge policy. Thank you very much to the viewer who has given us this. So on the 1st of December 2014, the local the local democracy think tank has pushed out a policy briefing document, 1st of December 2014. This is the British government boasting about how successful its behaviour change has been. And it's saying this briefing reviews the development of behavioural science and behaviour change in public policy. It highlights the work of the Cabinet Office Nudge Unit and the government's continued commitment. So here's the British government actively working to apply psychology to change our behaviour. It goes on and on. It's got personal and social responsibilities. it gets into the Mindspace document. Now you can just Google Mindspace and read this document. This is the government document that says we're going to have our views and values and behaviour changed, and we will not even realise it's been done. And who's going to be doing this stuff? Well, have a look at this bit here, because we've got a quote from none other than Oliver Letwin, MP, who describes the 4-year evolution of behavioural economics and behavioural science. And it's gone from scepticism, we didn't really believe it worked, to the fact, wow, we now know it does work. And who is this man, Letwin? Well, of course, he was the despicable politician who was throwing away classified documents in waste bins. So we're saying just watch out, because the government now is using this dangerous and hidden behavioural change policy, and they're boasting about how effective it is. I've put up the link there if you want to put that into the Google search engine and download this document for yourself. But again, it's the UK column that's been warning this subversive behavioural change is a key element of David Cameron's big society, which we are going to call communism light. Over to you, Mike.
Is it?
Oh no, sorry, I had one more.
Yeah.
You're looking surprised there, quite right too. Yeah, I just wanted to add that, sorry, I forgot we had these here, that essentially, if we've got applied behavioural psychology, we're saying, well, who are these people? Well, we've just had Letwin on screen. Have a look at this one. This is being tweeted around at the moment. So Cameron's joke to Sam before meeting Berlusconi, I'll leave the jacuzzi before the whores turn up. So the G20 meeting characterised by the fact that prostitution rocketed as all the national political teams went out for a good time with the girls. And we're just going to say, you know, this is the gutter morality of people like David Cameron and his Tories, Tony Blair, Nick Clegg. We've seen it across all three parties. And yet these are the people who are going to be working to change our behaviour. So are we relying on Theresa May to solve the problem, are we?
Well, apparently we are relying on Theresa May to solve the problem, but she's in a bit of trouble with the various victims groups and witnesses involved in the child sex abuse inquiry, who may be giving evidence to the child sex abuse inquiry, and they basically have given, or they're meeting Theresa May today to offer her an ultimatum, where basically they say either you give this inquiry some teeth, or we're not going to take part, and therefore it's a pointless exercise. So hopefully they stick to their guns on this and they don't back down. Of course, there are other options for this, and we would like to see Theresa May and her judge-led inquiry taken out of this equation altogether and replaced with a grand jury, perhaps.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we're going to be making some kind of announcement on that in the not too distant future.
We'll say Monday. We'll make
Monday,
an announcement on Monday. Well, just to ram home this sick situation where we know we've got massive child abuse, where the abusers are at the highest levels of the British establishment and government, and we've got articles like this. So the Mirror here has got a Mr. Bailey. Of course, he's tied in with the Association of Chief Police Officers, private company, supposedly leading on child protection. And he's saying that perverts who view child sex images online should be helped, not prosecuted. He does say, well, of course, if they're judged to not really be a risk to children, but look at the focus is on helping individuals. Shouldn't this man's focus be on finding out who the perverts were at the highest level of government abusing children at Elm Guest House in London? What is it with these senior police officers? They're obviously trying to just protect others at high level. And a little bit of propaganda I couldn't resist was the Telegraph back with the sad polar bears as if they're drifting 3 miles offshore and with no sustenance on their small little ice floe there. It says the right needs to wake up, climate change is real and we're causing it. Well, who said this? It's a guy called Rupert Myers, just happens to be a barrister and commentator with a focus on society and the law. So the Telegraph says if you don't want to believe climate change, you've got to be right-wing and extreme. And he's got a little story here that he goes to have a look at the view of the sea somewhere in Norfolk, and all he can see is windmills. He doesn't like them, but he says at the end, I am persuaded that we need them. So he is persuaded that all the polar bears are dying, global warming, man-made global warming is real. And so we're just going to say, so why is it, Rupert, that there are thousands of scientists who have actually been saying we don't believe a word of it? And I'll just have a bit of a dig at this man. The name is Rupert, which was always regarded in the military as somebody who was a bit of a buffoon. Sorry for all those out there who are called Rupert, but it's classic, isn't it?
Right, we're going to end on this one. This is an article from July. Labour peer escapes probe over 20 child sex claims because he was suffering dementia. And this is... I can't remember. This is Lord Janner, a Labour Life peer. He represents Leicester. He was representing Leicester as an MP for 30 years before he became a peer. And then in December 2013, he had his home searched, but he also had his parliamentary office searched because he's a serving peer. And as a result, evidence was found against him. And it was decided that he could not, however, be prosecuted or the probe taken further because he is suffering from dementia. Now, he is elderly, he's 86 years old, and maybe he is suffering from dementia, but the point here is he is still a sitting Lord in the House of Lords with a parliamentary office, which was searched in December 2013. And so, as a result, John Galloway has put up this petition on 38 Degrees. Now, we're not a fan of 38 Degrees in particular, and we're not a fan of petitions either, but I think that this is absolutely worthwhile getting involved with because his title here, as you can see, MPs or peers with dementia to be removed from Parliament, and this is to the Speaker of the House of Commons and the Lord Speaker. I'll just read this out. It says, introduce a parliamentary process that will ensure that no participant in either house can remain in situ once they've been diagnosed by proper and correct medical examination to have dementia. Why is this important? It has been reported in the press recently that a member of the House of Lords was deemed unable to stand trial to answer allegations of serious sexual offences because he suffered from dementia. However, that peer can still continue to participate in the debates and the lawmaking process in the House of Lords. If an elected member of Parliament in the House of Commons or a peer in the House of Lords is unable to stand trial because of dementia, it is patently absurd that they are allowed to participate in the lawmaking process of the country. Bad law is born out of poor scrutiny and reasoning, and a person not equipped with all their faculties will be unable to fulfil the high expectations of the public. Common sense dictates that parliamentary process must now be put in place, and I think we would agree with everything that's said in that statement.
The trouble is, Mike, I think we're going to find a lot of politicians going because most of them seem to be out of their minds in one shape or the other. There we are. Doomwatch, probably.
Doomwatch, 6 o'clock tonight. Don't forget it. Actually, Alex has a pretty significant announcement to make, so please make sure that you're there if you can. And also, immediately after this programme, we're playing out an interview that I did with Rodney Atkinson and John Hurst on Monday, which is about the government's consultation on a new Magna Carta. And what we basically did was to look through the list of questions that they've asked in their questionnaire, which is forming this public consultation, to see how many of these loaded questions actually it's possible to answer without, in any kind of honest way. So please have a look at that. We'll show it again in due course, no doubt. But that's on straight after this programme.
Brilliant. There we are. Thank you very much for joining us. And
thanks to Mark.
And thanks to Mark, of course.
Yes.
And Doomwatch tonight. We'll be back 1 o'clock Monday. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.